Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I just want to welcome you, those of you who are watching this later on the replay. The good afternoon, good evening is for you all. I just wanted to welcome those of you who are here live with us today. We are, I believe, in for a treat and deeper understanding of what we can do to advocate and support our children legally. I think we're going to learn a lot. I was so excited to learn about special education attorney Matthew Storey. I believe from just what I've read, just in being in conversation with him, I really do feel the energy and the heart of what he does that informs the way that he makes decisions for children with special needs when it comes to their education and just equity in education. So I am so excited. I'm here to learn as well this morning. The greater part of a 16-year journey, but I am still learning right alongside you all. I know I just want to do our housekeeping rules. We are recording. That's going to be available on the video replay page and also our YouTube page. We'll have any slides that are available. You'll just be able to click just above the video on Friday and download those, look at those, use them as notes. But if we could, let's go on and just give a COVID clap. We're still in the pandemic. So this one, let me make sure. This one doesn't touch this one, and you're clapping. Let's welcome, I know a lot of you are off cam, but I know that you're doing this, even though we can't see you. Welcome, special education attorney, Matthew Storey. We're so happy to have you this morning.
I'm happy to be here. It's an absolute pleasure. And so I guess what, conceptually, I'll just kind of introduce who I am, what I do. And then the purpose of today is to briefly go over the special education process so that you understand a little bit about the law. It's extremely robust, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. How the process itself works, how IEPs work, and then how to advocate, just things that make it a lot easier for parents to advocate on behalf of their children, because so many issues that I think we run into as parents, I've run into, are really remediated quite quickly if we do one or two things. And so we are a small group. So at any time, you guys can just interrupt me. It's not a problem at all. I'm happy to have it. And I also have time at the end. But if you hear me say something and maybe that pertains to you or you have questions, just stop and let me know, because I've got plenty of time today to talk. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I can do it correctly. I think I got it. Did I do it right? Are we looking like I nailed it? All right. All right, so just a quick, so my name is Matt Storey. I'm a civil rights attorney and I only practice special education here in California. We're a group of 3 attorneys at my office. Again, we specifically just focus on special education, but that's extremely vast, which I'll get into. I got into this field right out of law school. I have a brother with cerebral palsy, and so pretty much straight course right into this. He's doing really well, just FYI, people always ask. Prior, my experience in school, my brother's a year younger than I am. And so our experience was not good. Like probably a lot of people's now, it's much better than it used to be. But, for example, my brother was isolated in a room by himself for months just because they couldn't handle his particular disabilities. These things don't typically happen anymore in the state of California. But nonetheless, that's how I got into this field. So it's an extremely important field. It's, I think, the best area that we can work in law, and I like doing it. San Diego particularly is a great place to do this because we have so many services, so many supports. There's so much available out there. A lot of what we run into is just how to access it. Who do we speak to? How do we ask for things? And hopefully through this presentation, we can give you some understanding of how to do that. And so to start off with, and I'm only going to talk a little bit about the law. We're going to go just briefly into it, but everything that we do, everything that we work on or that you get through special education is through what we call the IDEA, the Federal Law of the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And this act's been around for actually about in various forms since 1973. And the idea of the law was, prior to that, most kids with disabilities were either warehoused in special schools if they had them, or to be honest, they were at home. They didn't, as a matter of fact, I still go to school board meetings today where baby boomers, it's always baby boomers, and I don't mean that offensively, I just mean that seems to be the group. They say, well, there are more disabilities now than there ever was. And as if that has something to do, like as if we're diagnosing more people with disabilities, and it's just not true. The reason that is, and I always try to explain it to them, is because kids in your generation, you just didn't see. They were not allowed in school. And so the IDEA was really about pulling the veil down on this massive issue, bringing kids into schools, and more importantly, ensuring that they could ideally become as independent as possible. I mean, if you think about what was probably happening is, these kids were not afforded any services or supports, and then ended up either being wards of the state or just being taken care of by their families. Now the focus is all about trying to get kids as independent as possible, from whether or not maybe they need speech services or whether or not they need a residential home, whatever it might be. The idea is that they go on and be as productive as they possibly can. And where the law intertwines with what parents want is, it's not looking for the best, of course, of what kids can do. And we as parents want that. But nonetheless, the IDEA is about accessing education, becoming independent, and making progress. And a recent case, and this is the only case I'll talk about, illustrates what we're looking for as a baseline of what we should be seeing, which is that a school district offering a special education program or an IEP needs to develop something that's reasonably calculated to ensure a student makes progress over time. What that progress could mean, it varies substantially. So one of the things that I think shocks everybody right away is understand that this is not just about academics, right? Many cases that I've done, that other people have done, we might have a student who's cognitively 130 IQ, getting B's and A's, but still requires a special education program. And why that might be: behavioral, social issues. One of the first cases we took to trial years ago was a kid was brilliant. And he basically developed two things: a case of severe OCD and agoraphobia, refused to leave his room. And the school at that time said, well, wait. He's a straight A student, or almost a straight A student. Why do we need to do anything more than that? And in fact, they did, because his refusal to leave his room, his behavioral and social concerns were just as important as the academic concerns. And so this was a case where they actually had to pay for a residential treatment facility out of state, and because it was the only place that could accommodate his specific diagnosis and then remediate. He, by the way, he's doing amazing. I actually hear from him every year, actually twice a year, and he's doing really well. But the important thing to understand, as we'll go into, is a school may have to provide something as minimal as speech and language services, or as substantial as a residential treatment in another state. It really just depends on whatever that student needs in order to make progress over time. That's what we really are looking for. And so, and this can also be with students. A lot of kids I work with, especially recently, tend to be in juvenile hall or in jail. Regular jail, unfortunately, or in foster homes. And they're, they don't always have the support necessary for children with IEPs or disabilities. And so sometimes we're removing kids from those facilities and placing them in residential therapeutic centers. So this is all encompassed within the IDEA. It is not something that is just school focused. It's progress focused. It's student focused. And that could be anything that's needed there. So the reason this is important is because a lot of people here, we don't do that. We don't provide that. That is not something we can do. You hear that, that's a pretty serious red flag, because that's almost, well, it's just untrue usually. If the student needs it to make progress academically, socially, behaviorally, school's going to have to provide it, regardless of whether they're a charter school, public school, whatever it may be. To begin with, the first part we want to look at is just how the initial part of the IEP process and special education process works. The biggest thing to understand with the beginning of this process is child find. What this means is that the beginning of the process is that a district is required to identify, locate, and evaluate any child who is suspected of having a disability. It's their obligation to do that. Now, they don't always trigger that, and that's okay. Usually it's a parent or an outside provider who says, hey, I had this experience. He's not talking as soon as he should be. This was my experience with special education. And so we went and pursued an evaluation, actually through regional center and then through the school district. But nonetheless, the school is required to find children that are suspected of having a disability. And this could be something, the suspected issue is the big one, but this could be just a parent saying, listen, I have some concerns. I'm not seeing, my child isn't speaking. He's becoming behavioral. Maybe he's failing school. That is what suspected disability means. It's important as a parent or as a provider who's working with a parent to address this through writing with the school, but also to make sure you're notifying them that you may have some concerns. A lot of times, parents have communication with the schools about their concerns, right? You have that kindergartner, that first grader, and you're saying, yeah, something seems wrong. When you're having these issues, I would suggest putting it in writing, which I'm going to go over quite a bit. But nonetheless, child find is what starts this process. You have to seek out, or you have, as a parent or provider, you have to go out and notify a school district if you suspect there's an issue. I would suggest you do that in writing. It's good to keep a record of this stuff. And to be frank, the law is triggered by writing in most cases. So if you're having that issue right now where you feel like something is wrong, but nothing is being done, it's a great time to shoot off an email to maybe the teacher or somebody at the school and say, hey, I have some concerns. I'd like you to do this. Now, what's really important too is that this is a continual obligation. What a student is experiencing in kindergarten, they may not experience in third grade, right? The speech issue may have gone away, but now you may have a behavioral issue. So this is always ongoing. It's extremely common for a student to be assessed, for a disability in one grade and then reassessed maybe for another concern that has appeared, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever years later. And so know that at any moment you can send an email, you can make a request for a school to do an assessment based on a concern that you're observing. Once you make this request, I'm going to go over a few timelines today just because they are important. In California, you should receive an assessment plan within 15 days. Now, to put a pin in this for just a second, if you get it on the 16th day, don't call a lawyer. If you get it on the 17th day, don't call a lawyer. It's a timeline. It's meant to be adhered to. But, if the school's a little late on this, at least from a legal issue, that is not a big deal. You start pushing a month, yeah. But nonetheless, you should receive it in 15 days. If you don't, send another email. Reach out again. Be willing to say, hey, I haven't heard back from you with regards to this assessment plan. It's the most effective way to do it. Prior to any of these assessments, they have to receive written consent. It's rare for a school to do an assessment, a real formal assessment, without getting a parent's permission. I've seen informal assessments that maybe a teacher might do just to get a baseline of what's going on, perfectly fine. But an actual formal assessment, they need to get the permission to do it. And what's going to happen is they're going to give you about a 2 or 3 page document, depending on the district. And it's going to list out the assessments they're going to do. So you want to make sure that you take a look at them. I'll go over that in a second. But once you sign the assessment plan, the district has 60 days to complete the assessment and hold an IEP meeting. And again, give them a little bit of a grace period here. A lot of times, if we're doing 5 or 6 assessments, it's going to take some time to do. It's not an easy process. And typically there's a lot of other assessments going on. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't comply with it, but I definitely have over the last 10 years or so received calls where it's like 65 days. And it's like, well, I don't think that's as big of a deal as you think it is. We want to give them a little bit of flexibility in doing this. Review that assessment plan. Okay, it's so easy when schools give us documents to sign off on them. I have 2 kids. I have done this. I have absolutely received something from the school I need to sign, even as a lawyer, in what I do with a student on an IEP, and gone, okay, I'll sign. Just because I'm busy. You get busy, you sign off on things. But when it comes to these specific documents, review them. Make sure, because anybody that's been in this field long enough has seen a parent's concern not be put on the assessment plan. Maybe you wanted a speech assessment and they ended up doing an OT assessment, whatever it might be. So take a look. More often than not, people don't review them. So the assessments are done. I didn't want to go too much into too complex for today. But once you have the assessments done, you have the IEP document. This is usually the tougher part for everybody. IEPs can be 20 to, I've seen 90-page IEPs. They're really difficult sometimes to understand, especially depending on how complex a student might be. You can have a lot more information, a lot more supports. But I think when you're starting off in this process, when you're just beginning, or even if you've already begun, but you're still a little confused about what's going on, I think there are really 3 things as a parent we want to focus on. It's what I focus on too. It's your present levels of performance, it's the goals, and it's the services. Now, of course, there's a lot of other stuff out there. You've got your state testing and all kinds of stuff. But I think, again, this stuff comes and goes. It's very quick. So in order to get a real handle on it, these are the 3 things that, I always tell parents, this is what you need to focus on, because this is the important stuff. The present levels of performance, really straightforward. They are, where is the student functioning at today? And accuracy is key. They should perfectly describe a student at that time, academically, behaviorally, their speech, adaptive skills. That you should read that and go, that is my kid. That is exactly right. And a really good way to do that, if you can, is to try to test it out. It's obviously hard depending on, like, a lot of the IEP is speech, which I had to deal with a year ago. It's very difficult to test that out. I knew my son wasn't speaking. That was easy to know, but I couldn't test out, the actual articulation stuff. But nonetheless, if you can do it, and this is why, if the school is saying that your child can count from 1 to 20, that's what it says in math, but they can count from 1 to 100, you may have wasted a year, right? Because they're going to be working on 21 to 100 throughout that year, because in the IEP, that's what it's telling them they need to work on. They already could do that. And so a lot of times we as parents are not seeing progress because the IEP present levels were written wrong, right? The student could already do that. They were performing, that already. That happens constantly. And so take the time if you can. Make sure that this is accurate. Really question it to make sure that they know, because sometimes a student on Monday may perform one way and on Tuesday may perform a different. Anybody with kids knows this, right? If your kid may act one way on Monday and completely different on Friday, right? Maybe Friday they show up to school and they're done. Not a good day to test the present levels, but maybe Monday was the good day. So, think rationally through this. What is most effective? What is most helpful? And so with your present levels, do your best to test them, especially the younger ages. As students get older, as they start bringing, maybe concepts that we've forgotten from school, way more difficult. But if you can do it. But nonetheless, you should read it and see your child. And the second part is the goals, right? This is where we want the student to go at the end of a calendar year. And this is a really big place for a parent to participate. Where do you want to see your child? What are the issues that you are seeing that you would like to see the school work on? Because this is where it goes. If you see all academic goals, but you're like, well, wait a minute, what about the fact that he has no friends? Or, is having issues with speech, or he's having issues with handwriting. This is where we put that. This is the work that the district is doing throughout a calendar year. Right? So if you're reading that IEP, you've done your present levels, but now you're in the goals and you're not seeing your concerns, it's really important to speak up, right? Because a lot of times goals will just focus on academics, but there may be some other issues out there that you're seeing that you want them to focus on. Get them to put it here. Okay. Goals, relatively straightforward. They need to be measurable. Right? You should be able to see it and go, okay, I understand how we're going to measure this. Some are a little bit more difficult than others, but nonetheless, you have a baseline, meaning where is the student starting off from? And then you have the goal, where are they going to go at the end of the calendar year? You should be able to equate that as best as possible. Not everything can be mathematical, right? But it should be as close as you can, because if it's not, and you can't measure it, you're not going to be able to tell whether or not there's been progress. So this is the present levels begin the process. They facilitate the baselines of the goals, and then the goals are there to ensure that a student is actually, making progress and that we're measuring it. We're keeping accurate data on it. So the goals can be as many as you need to an extent. I've seen people trying to put like 30 goals into an IEP. Teacher's not going to be able to do that. But, as many as needed to address the student's unique needs, and they need to be measurable. and so put the work into these because it's really important. And before you go to an IEP meeting, I would really suggest sitting down and thinking about, okay, where are my concerns? The school has theirs, you have yours, what are we seeing? And I want to give a couple examples, just 2 examples of some goals, just because, again, this is an issue that I think we run into consistently, bad goals, bad measurable goals. And so here's something that we see a lot. Maybe a student, the baseline will say the student is approaching a 2nd grade level math. Okay, so just to start off, I understand that, right? I mean, it somewhat makes sense, but then the goal itself says by the end of the year, the student will successfully complete 80% of multiplication and division problems as measured by teacher. Okay, that is functionally different than the baseline. Because for all we know that the student's doing 79% of these math equations. This is why it's important to test. You see, it makes some sense, but if it's not really measurable, this is where we start losing time. We start losing a year or 2 because we're not accurately measuring this stuff. Another example is student can successfully complete 60% single digit multiplication problems 2 out of 4 times. And then you see here in the goal, easy to equate. We go to 95% 4 out of 4 times. That is what it should pretty much look like. Now, and again, not everything can be placed into a perfect measurable category, but if it can, it should be, because you are the ones that are going to be holding on to this IEP document. Year after year, the student is going to change classrooms, right? It can be with one teacher 1 year, another teacher the 2nd year. You're the best advocate for your kid. And so you want to make sure that you are measuring progress. And this is one of the surest ways to do it, to make sure this stuff is measurable, okay? And then we have services. So we've got present levels, we have goals, and now we move into the idea of services. And this is really complex sometimes to explain. As I mentioned earlier, a school district can provide anything from speech and language to an out-of-state residential. They do it all the time. It's really about what does that student need to access their education and make progress. Very difficult to understand for a lot of different school districts, right? Because we hear a lot sometimes working with kids that we don't do that. Well, they do. You just have to figure out how to access it. But a lot of the ones that we typically see, that you might see on your IEP or that you've seen quite a few times before, maybe specialized academic instruction. What this refers to is a lot of times students who are initially placed on an IEP are offered a special education classroom. There are so many different types of these in different districts. What Poway Unified does is way different than what San Diego Unified does. They have completely separate names for their classrooms. And that goes all up and down the state and all over the country. But nonetheless, we see it placed maybe a special day class, a moderate to severe class, an RSP class, all different. The idea behind that is that that these classrooms these classrooms are put together with special education teachers for a specific set of kids. A lot of times you see very similar behaviors, very similar academic abilities in these classrooms. Ideally, they shouldn't be in there all day. Especially starting off. We are supposed to educate kids in what we refer to as the least restrictive environment, meaning that they should be educated with their typical peers as much as possible, which I'll go over here in a minute. But nonetheless, this SAI or special academic instruction, what I'm referring to is the idea of a special education classroom. Other services out there might be speech and language or OT or physical therapy. That's a very common one. Adaptive physical therapy, counseling and mental health. Nursing support. I've worked with many kids who have a one-to-one nurse with them all day, or other one-to-one assistance if needed. Transition services, and again, there's just so much more. It depends on, again, all goes back to what that student might need. And a lot of times we're going to get pushback because what we think the student needs, or what, as parents, we think a district's are going to disagree. And then it's just about proving what might need. And oftentimes that's where an advocate and a lawyer might need to come in. But nonetheless, trying to access these services, which we'll go into in a minute, know that they just exist. Know that there's really no such thing as no. That's really important. Least restrictive environment. This is what I was talking about, special education versus general education. So really in the 80s, we got to, this was, my brother was younger, we got to the point where a lot of school districts had just specialized schools. You have a disability, you go to this specialized school. This was really popular in California. And in a lot of areas, it was fantastic. But right around then, schools decided to really push what we call mainstreaming, which is taking this student and putting them into the maximum extent appropriate. That's actually what the language says, with their typical peers, the general education peers. Mostly because the majority of all studies that came out show that there's a lot of positive growth through that, and that isolating students teaches them how to be isolated in life. Now, funny thing, my parents were actually really upset by this because they loved the special ed school my brother was in. And it was, as you can imagine, it was an extremely hard transition back to go from where he was to a general education class. But schools do a much better job now, I think. So when we're talking about any type of placement, we should be always, if a school says, hey, we have this moderate to severe class for your child or whatever it might be, one of the questions we should ask as parents is, well, why can't we do that in the general education environment? What would it take? Maybe it's a one-to-one aid. Maybe it's just a little bit of, a special ed teacher checking, whatever it might be. Don't think that the starting point for special education is removal into a special education class. I think is really important to understand. We automatically tend to accept that. And I think it's really worth pushing a district on this question of why can't we do this in the general education environment? And of course, there are situations where, a lot of situations where it may be totally appropriate. It absolutely may be completely reasonable to say, listen, I know you're just getting an IEP, but we think a special education classroom is going to be the best thing to do. Very common, actually, but it's still worth questioning, because many cases that come through here and through a lot of my other colleagues, they probably could have been in the general education environment the entire time with a little bit of extra support. And a lot of times it's just not given because it's a lot easy just to put the kids in the classrooms that you already have available to you. Other things that you might say, and this is just really quickly, I've already kind of covered this. You have your resource classrooms, you have your special day classrooms, day treatment. I wanted to talk about because I got a few questions about this earlier. Day treatments are typically programs that have psychological services and medication management on site. So sometimes prior to a student perhaps needing a residential placement, the step below that is going to be a day treatment. And again, that usually some school districts have them on site. We have non-public providers that provide this too. And these are just really robust special education schools that provide services that typical schools don't. And the medication management usually tends to be one. And then they're much more therapeutic in nature. And the ones we have here are really good. And then of course, again, residential placement. I think what surprises people on residential placement, it's always surprised me, is that there are thousands of them. Not really in California, and I'll talk about that in a second, but a lot of them are in Utah and Arizona and Texas, Wyoming. They're all over the country. There are so many residential placements that there are actually people out there that spend their careers going to them, flying to different residentials, keeping data on them so that they can provide that with parents. A lot of times what we do, if I know a student needs residentials, I call one of them. And that's their specialty. That's all they do. They know everything about residentials and where to send students. There's that many. Interesting, a lot of them are owned by pharmaceutical companies. That's not a political statement, but you do see that quite a bit. It's very interesting. But let me move into the IEP. Here we go. So you've got your assessments, you've got your IEP, and now you have to go to IEP meetings. I will say I have done this as a parent. I don't like it. As a matter of fact, even as a special ed attorney doing this for a long time, I actually brought an advocate to my last one, just because it's your kid. You never know if you're going to miss something, even in my job. And it was very helpful. And so there's a lot of things to understand about these meetings. They can be very stressful. I understand that. There's a lot of people out there that can help with that. But nonetheless, the important things to understand are that the school has to contact you before a meeting. Okay. So real quick, I have received notice that I'm going to have an IEP meeting. It was a Wednesday and I was going to have one on Thursday. I said, no, know that you can do that. They're required to schedule it with enough time and opportunity for you to attend when you can. Sometimes we have bigger deals, emergencies that come up that maybe we want to get there that day. But just know that you can send a school date. So a good practice is this: when a school wants to schedule an IEP meeting or you want to schedule an IEP meeting, send some dates and times that work. It's really effective. And I usually suggest 3. Here's 3 days that work for me and 3 times that work with me. That's a real effective way to do that. A lot of times, especially right now, it might be a little easier with Zoom, but because IEPs are still being done on Zoom. But prior to that, people were really stressed out because they would have to take time off work or something along those lines. Now it's a little easier. Parents might be able to participate on their lunch break, but just know that you can absolutely request times and dates. You're not required to show up on the date and time that they've given you. You want to work with them to the best you can, because you might be one person, which I'm going to talk about, don't do that, and they might have 5 or 6. So of course, scheduling, it's always harder to get everybody else together, but make sure that that you can provide other dates. You can bring people with you. Do this. Don't go alone. And it doesn't have to be an advocate, right? And my mom was an advocate. She was really, it's again, another reason I got into this. There was nobody in the 80s for special ed. I think there was one attorney in the state, but bring a friend, bring a couple friends. It's so uncomfortable, I think, sometimes, depending on the team, to be at an IEP meeting by yourself. And so know that you can bring whoever you want to an IEP meeting. You actually don't have to let them know who you're bringing. I tell people to do that because, space, if once we go back to school, they need a room that can fit everybody. And so, I would let them know who you're bringing. Now with Zoom, it's a lot easier. And you can record IEP meetings. This always becomes a little point of contention, especially if you're new to the process. I don't record my IEP meetings. So guilty. I don't do that at all. I've thought about recording my IEP meetings, but so far the team, for me, is doing really well. And so I really have no reason to record them. But it can be good practice. If you feel like maybe your voice isn't being heard, if you're starting to feel like there's no progress, in California, you give 24 hours notice and you can record the IEP meeting. And it's just, from a lawyer's point of view, it's fantastic, because then we have really a real-time idea of what was going on. And that's really a nice thing to have. And so think about doing it. But again, I totally understand why it's uncomfortable, why we may not want to do it. At minimum, an IEP has to be revisited every year. Know that you can call an IEP anytime you want. They have to hold it in 30 days, not over summer, not over breaks, but you really can. And again, we do have parents that call in every 3 months still. And I do think depending on the student, it's actually a really good practice because it helps keep you informed. So the more complex maybe a student is, the better idea it is to have multiple IEP meetings. I'm going to go into this a little bit in advocacy, but always feel free to do that. They're required to hold one the second you ask for it, or within 30 days. And then a student has to be reassessed every 3 years. And what that means is every 3 years, you get what's called a Triannual Evaluation. That is reassessing a student's disability or eligibility, and then also making sure that the services and supports are appropriate. Again, this is something that can be done more than that. And with a district's child find obligation, a district may have to look at a completely separate area at any time. You might see another issue pop up and you can request that assessment be done. So the assessments every 3 years, but you may want one done, or you may want them done either sooner, or you may want a new assessment done to address another area. These are just the baseline things that districts are required to do. Every year, the IEP, every 3 years, the assessment. Those are the minimum requirements, but you can always ask for much more. Well, I just went over some of this. One of the things you do want to point out if you're asking for new assessments is, are you seeing some new issues? Are you seeing a lack of progress? Those goals aren't being met. Do you not agree essentially with what the school is doing? That happens. It's okay. That's a great reason to request assessment. So let's say that you believe that the district isn't addressing a specific area. They tell you that they are. Great reason to go, okay, I hear what you're saying, so I'm going to go ahead and request an assessment in that area, right? You get your data right there. And typically a district is going to do that. Sometimes it requires, a little push. But nonetheless, typically they are going to do that. And then advocating. So we've gone through kind of a little bit of the law of the IEP process, and we have some limited time. So right now I want to talk a little bit about some things that I've seen that can help parents better advocate for their kids. moving forward. This is a big one. You got to request the records. So if you're a parent and you have a child with an IEP and you don't have their educational records, request them. Just send an email right now and get them in 5 days. The reason this is important is just, year after year, parents seem to come and we tend to work with them. They're not as informed as I wish they would be about their child's IEP and services. And I understand why. It's real easy to just kind of, know the district's doing what they're supposed to be doing or hope that they are. But, parents, after they tend to review records, can be a little shocked that they're not, maybe there isn't the progress they thought that was going on, or that they didn't actually understand what the programming is. So in California, you have the right to request records. They should send them to you in 5 days. If you haven't done that, it's a great thing to do. It's a great place to start. Put the records together so that you have a copy of everything that's happened. Make sure that you understand them. So now that you've gotten them, it's unbelievably important. You go through and you read them. Especially, if you have a 15-year-old, you don't want to read 10 years of documents. Totally understand. Even as a lawyer, I don't think we really want to do that. But, going through the last couple IEPs, the last set of assessments, that should be your first stop. So if you have an IEP maybe coming up and you've got a lot of concerns, here's where you start. Request the records, review everything, make sure that if you have questions that you're asking them about the assessments and the IEPs. They're confusing, even for me, and I've been looking at them for so many years. I've read assessments and I've finished reading an assessment and I've gone, okay, I have no idea what just happened in this assessment. And that might indicate, by the way, that it's not a good assessment. But these are questions that we would need to answer if we're not understanding that. And again, one of the main things I'll do with parents that I meet with is I'll sit down and go, do you understand this? Because I just want to get on, make sure that as we move forward, you do. And a lot of times, no. And I can understand why. Translation, this is really important. All documents upon request and all IEP meetings need to be translated. And when I say translated IEP meetings, I mean somebody needs to be there to facilitate that the parent's understanding what's going on. And then if you request your documents, your IEPs and your assessments be translated, the district's required to do that. They should have already done it. It takes time to do it though. If you've never done that before, and there's a lot of documents that you're asking for, depending on the school, San Diego Unified is actually pretty fast, but some school districts are a lot slower. So there's no real timeline for that. There's nothing defined in the law, but know that you can get all those documents translated, whatever your native language is. And again, it's another reason we're actually pretty lucky in San Diego, because we're really diverse and we have a lot of resources to translate documents in almost every language I think that we run into, which is great. Read the IEP with a highlighter. So now that you've gotten those records, your last IEP, I like telling parents, grab a highlighter. I use one all the time. This is how I do it. And I highlight everything that I do not understand or do not agree with. It's a great place to start, and it's easy to do. Read those present levels. Are they accurate? Read the goals. Are they in all the areas? Do you understand them? Can you measure them? And then after that, now that you've read the records, you've highlighted what you don't understand, now you call an IEP meeting. It's a great place to start, because now you're informed about what you don't know, essentially. And that's really important. Now you can sit down with the team and go, guys, I don't understand why we're doing these goals, or I don't understand what this present level means, or you're saying that he's in a specialized special education class. What does that mean? You should know how many kids are in there. What types of disabilities do they have? How long are we going to stay there? And why can't we place them in a general education environment? There's a lot of things out there that we should be asking as part of that IEP. And this is just a nice little trick to do it, because it's a lot of information. And put it in writing. What I talked about earlier with assessments, and it's just kind of a legal concept, but it's important. A lot of the things in special education are triggered by writing. Right? If you were requesting assessments, that there's actually provisions in the law that say once they put it in writing or say at an IEP meeting, you've got to do it. So it's a really good thing to have that conversation with the teacher and then follow up in writing and put any requests or concerns in an email. Now, don't email the whole district, just email the teacher or maybe whoever the case manager might be. But it's one of those things where a lot of you'll hear this over time, especially in our field. If it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. And so parents might say, well, they told me they were going to do A, B, and C. I'm like, okay, how did they tell you? Well, she told me when I visited the classroom. Okay, well, if it's not in writing, there's not much an attorney can do with it. And so it's just, again, I'll tell a parent, well, go follow up in writing, see if you can confirm that. And that really helps the process move along. So if a school is going to provide something or tell you something, you feel like maybe that's something you want to confirm, put it in writing. You'll make yourself a lot easier. And again, with preparing for the IEP, always read the last one. I'm actually doing this right now. So the reason I have this highlighter, and I'm not going to show it, I'm actually reviewing my son's IEP right now. Write down those questions. And then again, be specific. Feel free to call that IEP meeting to review it, and don't go alone. I've said this a few times, but I actually think it's really important. We have a lot of advocates out there. So feel free to call us. I will give you names of all of them really. They're all great. And if you can't do that, because sometimes it's not financially feasible, I understand, take some friends. One of the great things about how the special education community has developed over time is people aren't as isolated as they used to be. I actually think it was one of the biggest problems we used to have. It was certainly in my family. You have a son, a sibling with a disability, you're kind of isolated from the rest of the world and maybe the rest of the special education community. We don't have that anymore. You can go on a Facebook group right now and ask a parent, hey, can anybody come to the IEP meeting with you? And you'll probably have 50 people that'll say, happy to go. And that's such a fantastic, so use it. Take advantage of those things. We're very lucky with that. No, at the IEP meeting, you should be asking, are we seeing progress? Is there any regression? Right now with COVID, that's a big one, right? With all the distance learning, are we seeing the actual program? Ask why. If we're not seeing progress, why aren't we seeing it? What is happening? What are we doing wrong? What can we do to make it right? What changes should we be making to address this? You as a parent don't have to have an answer for that. And you shouldn't. I wouldn't have that. But if I don't have the answer for that, and the school doesn't have the answer for that, that's when we assess. So if you're seeing a lack of progress, if you're seeing some regression and the school says, well, this is all we can do, or we don't know what to do, great, assessments. Let's do an assessment. Let's try to figure out, bring a professional speech pathologist in here or psychologist in here to figure out what we can do. That's always available to you. And again, maybe the placement needs to change. Maybe the services need to change. These are things that you can be asking. And again, if you don't know it, you can just ask for an assessment, because a lot of times when we're working with parents, anybody's working with a parent, I'm not going to have the answer on what's there to fix, whatever's been going on. So I'm going to be doing assessments. And the way I'm going to do them, by the way, is this: independent educational evaluations. Now, a really cool area of the law, one of the, I think, the more parent-friendly provisions, is that when a district assesses, you as a parent have the right to request an independent educational evaluation. This is where the district pays for, and you choose the assessor to come in and do that assessment. We lawyers do it all the time. Advocates do it all the time, because a lot of times the assessments we're getting do not explain what's going on. I have one right here. There's clear regression, and I read it, and I again, having done this for so long, no idea what this assessment means. And so we will be asking for an independent assessment. You can do it too. And so if the school has conducted an assessment and you don't like it, maybe it's not explaining what you want, or maybe there's a disconnect between the IEP team and you, this is something you can request. Do it in writing. Or maybe if they failed to assess, maybe they're telling you for a year, we're not going to do an assessment or something, you can request that as well. Now, they have to either fund it or they have to file a due process. Understand this, that it's not a guarantee that they're going to give it to you. Typically, right now, schools are doing independent educational evaluations for the most part. We don't get a lot of pushback on that. It's an ebb and a flow. But as of right now, I think that for the most part, every parent I know that's asking for IEs is usually getting them. You do it in writing. But a district, if they've done assessments and you've disagreed and asked for IEs, they could potentially file a due process to defend their assessments. It's a bad move on the districts, right? Because you file a due process or a complaint against a parent, you've destroyed the relationship and you've ensured that they don't trust you. So it's not typically done, but know that that can happen. They can't just say no, and they can't ignore you. There's no set timeline for IEs. Typically, they've got to get back to you within a month. if they're going to do it or not do it. But again, if you are in a position right now, like I'm sure a lot of people are, where you just feel that something is wrong, you're not seeing that progress, and there's a disconnect between you and the school, this is the path almost every, I think, advocate or attorney is going to ask you to do, and it's a good way to go. And by the way, if you need a list of providers, I'm more than happy to provide you a list of providers. They're going to give you a list, and almost everybody on the list that schools keep actually are really good. There's not a lot of people on there I wouldn't use. So just know that that list is usually pretty good, but reach out to lawyers or advocates. They'll give you the list of names. There are people that are really thought of highly in the community that do great assessments in all areas. And then approach. I've always liked this. IEP meeting, showing up at an IEP meeting, it's just so important to try to keep your composure if you're frustrated or something along those lines. I always like to say that try to be as active as you can by asking questions, not necessarily demanding things. There's a difference between, saying, well, how much support does my child need? Why can't we place him into a general education environment? Then saying you will provide him a one-to-one aid in the general education. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't make a lot of sense to do that. At the end of the day, you need these people to be on your side. You do. And I think the more we butt heads, the more that parties tend to separate and then not work together. So do your best to try to make maybe suggestions, ask for assessments, ask for reasons they can't do certain things, as opposed to making demands. Now, you may get into that position where you have to just demand. There's just nothing you can do about it, right? You may be finally, maybe you've done the IEs and there's nothing out there that they're offering. You might have to, but nonetheless, I think this is a really good approach. A lot of why questions. It's the same thing that I do when I go to my IEPs. I don't go to clients' IEPs, but I go to my own sons, and that's usually what I do. Before you sign the IEP, take it home for a week or two. Take your time. It's, again, grab the highlighter, go through it line by line. We feel as parents a lot of pressure to sign that document at the meeting or the next day. You're getting those emails. Hey, have you signed it? Have you signed it? Don't do that. Don't sign it unless you've read it and you understand it and you've had an opportunity to make any changes you think. There's no timeline here. You can do that. They might say something like, well, we can't provide services to you until you sign it. Well, if they've changed the services, then yes. But for the most part, whatever the previous IEP was, that is implemented until you agree to the new one. And know that you can sign it in parts. You can absolutely say, listen, I agree to the present levels and goals, but I don't agree to this service. So there's, in most new IEPs on the new programs that they have, there's actually a box for that. But you don't need a box. You can just write it. I agree to this, this, and this. It's important to know that. And you will be able to do this once you read it. You might say, well, gosh, I agree to half of this. I'll just go ahead and get that going. And then work on the other parts by having other IEP meetings and maybe further assessments. It's okay to take your time with this. This document follows as long as it's needed. And you may be within this IEP process for years. So it's important not to feel rushed. It's important to feel informed. You can have an IEP meeting with questions, or you can also just send an email. Depends on how you feel. If it's only some minor things, you don't feel like you need a meeting for it, just send the questions or concerns in emails. A lot of times parents feel really nervous. I do, about asking questions in an IEP meeting. I'm getting a little better with that with my own family, but I will follow up in writing after. So know that you can do that. Again, you feel a lot more confident if you bring other people with you. I have noticed that. And that's pretty much it. I think we kept it right to the right amount of time, right? With about 10 minutes left. So I again, you guys, I went through this process really fast. There's so much more. And so we really just tried to give a baseline of what's going on, things that come up. But you can always reach out and ask me any questions through email or phone call. We're always here to talk. And again, we really are in one of the best communities, I think, for special education. We're better than better than LA, better than any other state, because of who is involved in this process and the amount of resources we have. It's just about accessing. And so, like I said, I've got plenty of time, so I'm more than happy to answer questions that you guys have. So feel free just to blot them out if you got them, or you can just email me as well, whatever you'd like.
Does anyone have any questions, anything that they want to add to the chat?
There we go.
I know I've had a couple parents that have sent me text messages. Um, but they will see this on the replay because I didn't see anything pop into the chat. Um, Modifying tests based upon a student's IEP accommodations means the student is disqualified for 4-year university attendance.
No.
Okay.
No, so I've actually had a lot of luck, or a lot of recent experience with this. A lot of time, there's a couple of things I want to go into with that. Kids on IEPs are not excluded for any reason from universities. As a matter of fact, I actually had a UC San Diego, which is where I went to school. They have a whole special education department. And to be honest with you, based on what they were telling me, they are actively recruiting kids and look at supporting kids with IEPs. And so, and I'm only speaking about the California system. I can't really talk about other colleges, but what I will tell you is absolutely not. In my opinion, I think having an IEP could be a boon to you going to college because it separates you so much from the rest of the herd. And that's a lot of times, at least in California, what schools are looking for. So don't think that having an IEP in any way impacts your ability to get into college. And most colleges now have departments, and my brother experienced this, they modify your work, they've got note takers, they're there. You just have to access it. And so in no way. The other thing that comes up, and I want to just briefly bring it because I feel like this is tangential to that question, is the military. This is a tough one I can't answer. Does having an IEP affect your ability to go into the military? I don't know. I've never got, I served in the military. And so I've tried to use those connections to figure that question out. And I've never gotten a straightforward answer. I know students who've had IEPs that have gone into the military without any issue. As a matter of fact, I've never seen a student not get into the military. I believe there are certain diagnoses that could be problematic. Actually, there's only one, and that's emotional disturbance. But again, the military changes over time. What they'll accept one year, they won't accept based on recruiting. And so I think that's why I didn't get a really good straight answer. But as far as college go, I don't think that's an issue at all. As a matter of fact, it's even better because if you have an IEP with modified testing, the colleges are going to do that. You rarely see a college not accommodating a student's disability. At least I haven't seen it in many, many years in California. I've got private questions.
Oh, sure.
Sure. So how do you obtain an IE? So the easiest way is to just request it in writing. Know that if the district hasn't done an assessment, they might say, well, whoa, we'd like to assess first. For me, I would usually just let them do that because the only alternative is you can either try to keep pressing them or you can get a lawyer. And as much as I love this field, if you can avoid a lawyer, you should avoid a lawyer, right? It really is important. That's why there's not a lot of us. You should go advocate mostly every time if you can, but nonetheless, just request it in writing. And finding a provider, that is really the provider, when a district gives you an IE, they're going to give you a list of potential providers. Don't look at that in a negative way. It's fine. They actually are really, every list I've seen has been pretty good. But if you feel like you want to reach out and find somebody else, just give us a call. I can give you the names of people that we use. Most people are going to be the same way. Transportation. So I think the question, if I understand it right, is a district required to provide transportation? Only if it's in the IEP. In the state of California, transportation is not required. To be honest with you, it's just something that school districts do and budget for. It's not actually written into the law. But if the IEP determines a student needs an transportation, then they have to provide it, whether it be door to door or whatever that might be. But it's a team decision, meaning, ideally you and the district. And can you tell me about how to get into a non-public school? That's really tough. So I placed a lot of kids in non-public schools over the years. It really depends on need. I don't have COVID. I'm so sorry. I have a bad cough. But non-public schools, so in San Diego, we've got quite a few. They are special education schools that are certified by the state to provide special education. They don't have general education peers in there. These are specifically for special education students. They serve different types of students, so it's really important to look into these before you decide you want to go. A lot of parents will come to us and say, well, I want a non-public school. You go, okay, well, why? Because the school's not doing what they're supposed to be. I understand. Which one do you want? One of them. Okay, they're way different. They're so different. So if you feel like you're going that route, I think it's important to first get a handle on what's out there and why it's out there. You can do that by calling. I can give you a list. But the other thing is that schools usually have to exhaust to some extent their resources before you do that. It's not exclusive, but I think it's good to know that you don't go from being in general ed to getting an IEP to right into a non-public school. Typically, schools are going to want to try their IEPs out for a period of time to make sure that they can either do it. And then legally speaking, it's when the school cannot accommodate that student is when they have to do a non-public school. But of course, that switches a lot. And we have a lot of them again in San Diego. So you've got a lot of opportunity to go to one. Is it hard to? Yes, it can be very hard to get to. The question is it hard to get into a non-public school? Typically, yes. I've seen IEP teams do it unilaterally. But my experience is really based on having to file lawsuits against the school. So usually we're having to force them. It really just depends on how bad the student's done. I mean, if we're reading IEPs and the student hasn't made progress and they seem to have tried a lot of different things, that might be a case for where we want to look at a non-public school. But it's not the answer to everything. Remember what you're doing. You're taking your student from, their public school and you're putting them into a private school. And that can have some negative consequences too. The biggest one is going to be socialization and being around your typical peers. So as a parent that gets a non-public school, I'm always encouraging parents, listen, you really want to try to find other places so that, whether it's sports or whatever is possible, so that they are getting access to their typical peers. You don't want that isolation going. But the reality is they are very good and you typically see a lot of progress.
Hey, Matt, I have one for you. Going back to the IEEs and the funder file, you said on your slide that they must fund, but what we're discovering is districts, schools have found that loophole in that they say no and then nothing happens. What do you recommend to parents when they do that?
Yeah, we run into that a lot. Where basically you ask for an IE and a district just says no or don't respond. So you have a couple options. The first is, first thing to understand is the timeline. There's no specific statutory timeline to respond to a parent. Like there's 15 days for an assessment plan, doesn't exist for independent assessments. And so, some courts have come out with like 40 days is too long, but nonetheless, what I would do as a parent, if I request an IEP, if I get a no, then you're going to have to go see an attorney if you want that IE. You just do. And again, I really do try to avoid that in any conversation I'm having with a parent. There's no real way around it. The second thing you can do is you can, if you really want to maybe avoid the law, is you can email or try to have an IEP meeting and say, for the purpose of having a discussion about it. So let's say you've made the request and you got a no. You could call an IEP meeting if you felt comfortable and go and say, this is why we're requesting this, and see if maybe they'll change their minds. It does happen. There's no reason not to. It really just has to do with time, right? If how rushed do you feel to get that assessment done? Are you okay with maybe waiting to try an IEP meeting and then potentially having to engage a lawyer? Or would you rather just engage a lawyer at that time? So it really just depends on what you're comfortable with. But nonetheless, the district has to fund or they have to file a due process. Does that make sense, Jenny?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Oh, it does. I know the ins and outs of it, but I just thought for everybody hearing that, because it seems very cut and dry. And the reality is schools have, of course, found a way around doing what they're supposed to do and what is right.
Well, the way around is the hope that a parent won't pursue after the no, right? And Jenny knows more than most people. She is a special education teacher. She's an advocate. So if you call and ask for an advocate, you'll get her number. But she knows a lot about this. And it's true. I think the district in some calculus goes, listen, if we say no a bunch of times, only a few of these guys are going to get lawyers, and then we'll just give them the IEP, but we save on the back end. I can't, we have this conversation a lot, right? With whether or not it's a calculated thing or they're just not doing it. I think, again, the best approach, if a district says no, you can either try an IEP meeting or you would get a lawyer. Most attorneys are going to look at that pretty aggressively, and it is extremely rare that a district doesn't settle with a parent to get them. But then, you've had to file a complaint to do it. And a lot of parents just aren't comfortable with that, which I completely understand. Melissa, you raised your hand. I've never used that function before, so I'm just going to let you go. Go for it.
I just had two more that came via text to ask if you. It's like two, but one of them is in two parts. Separate test setting is separate test setting considered a test modification? That's the first part.
So is a separate, would that be it would be a modification on the IEP or an accommodation. So that would be something if I felt that my son or daughter needed to be, have a separate test setting, I would want that written in the IEP. Absolutely.
Okay. The second thing is this same parent was saying, she requested a meeting with the student's teachers and asked the student's advocate to attend, and the advocate declined. Also didn't respond to emails or delayed response to the point the condition the correspondence is about has already occurred. Should the test be modified or not? I hope that's clear.
Well, I'll try to unpackage that a little bit, because to the advocate, I can't answer. That's not just a question. I don't know why they didn't respond. To the IEP meeting, they have, if you put it in writing, so if you haven't done that, put it in writing. Request the IEP in writing. A lot of times we do it verbally. We just assume they're going to do it. Don't do that. Put it in writing. As far as getting that placed into the IEP, it's got to be done in an IEP meeting. So the number one thing to do is to have that IEP. So if you haven't done it in writing, do that now. Request an IEP meeting. Then at that IEP meeting, you say, this is what I'd like to do in a separate setting. Now, understand they don't have to agree with you. That sometimes can be a bit of a pushback. They might go, well, we don't think that he or she needs that. And that might be something where you need to look at assessments if you feel like it's a really big deal. But nonetheless, it's one option. But I would put that in writing. More often than not, parents come to me and they just didn't put it in writing. And I know that sounds silly, and then I've repeated it like 10 times, but honest to gosh, I have multiple consults today. I will guarantee you 2/3 of them didn't put their request in writing. And so we'll just sit here on the computer, request it. It's fixed a week later.
Okay, my last one via text. The child is in, and this is kind of for part mine and part the person texting, because I have something similar. The child is in general education, is honors and AP. The child does not get to participate in the AVID program, if you're familiar with that, just because
I worked in that.
Guided Studies is taking a slot. But the Guided Studies teacher met me outside at curriculum night and was just like, I don't know why he's in Guided Studies. He's smarter than me. I can't help him with these classes. I did not know that the two couldn't coexist. Didn't really get the supports last year in the virtual setting. What I posed to this parent and also am saying to myself is perhaps, and this is maybe something, would you suggest all parents who saw just a decline or just didn't see any growth, just didn't see anything last year in the virtual setting, would you suggest that they automatically request an IEE for this year if it's concerning to them enough to realize, okay, no growth, no significant decline, but you're seeing something?
So so if the thing is, okay, so we just went through COVID, and through that period we didn't see progress, maybe we saw regression, what should we do? What maybe should the next? So there's a couple things that you can do. I think the first thing to understand is that the state and federal government gave schools money for compensatory education. It is written into the law. So I want to start with that, meaning that they said, use this money to help remediate what was lost for each student. So I think to start off with, if you feel you know what would be needed to remediate whatever the area is, then I think you would call an IEP meeting and just ask for compensatory education. That's number one. But a lot of times we don't know the answer. I never know that answer, right? It's very difficult. So I think it's a great time to go, hey, listen, I'd like to get an IE. I want to figure out what the present levels are, where the area of struggle is, and how to remediate what was lost. That would be, in my opinion, the smarter way to go, because now you're starting from a place of information. And again, it's part of what I keep bringing up throughout this is when we're operating without information, we're operating in the blind. And so it's perfectly reasonable to keep assessing, to ask those questions. And so, yes, I would start off with an IE or an assessment to figure out baseline data, meaning where are we at today? So we actually have something to compare it to, and what is needed to remediate. And then from there, I would ask for compensatory education from the school if it's needed. And if they say no, that's when you might have to fight them a little bit. You know,
Okay.
but just, I think it's so important to keep repeating this to parents. They were given money for this. They were given money for this. And some districts have done actually a really good, well, I've seen cases where districts have done a really good job at actually just facilitating this. A parent goes, hey, I think we lost this. I think I went in Ramona, where they gave a bunch of hours to a student. They're like, yeah, well, we got money for this. A lot haven't because they don't know. Not everybody is reading the legislation like I am. Right? So teachers, you may go to an IEP meeting where literally nobody on that team knew that money was set aside for comp ed or whatever it might be. You should know that it exists.
Or some districts think it was used for staff childcare.
That's true.
I have that on a recording.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Where that money, but that money always exists, by the way. So anytime a student isn't seeing a lot of progress, or maybe something really went wrong, you always have the ability to ask for compensatory education, but a lot of times it's defining what it should be. And again, I'll give an example really quick just to go. I was working with a parent that was sure that they needed a very specific reading program. And so they got that by themselves with compensatory education. And lo and behold, the type of the dyslexia that the student has, I have dysgraphic dyslexia. He had orthographic dyslexia, completely separate reading program that he needed. So he went through like, I think $10,000 worth of a reading program, had almost no impact because they were working on the wrong reading program. So important to get assessments. Okay. So important. So yeah, there's my long answer to your short question.
That is wonderful. I see one in the chat from Miss Marshall. She says, does anyone know anything about Vista Transitional Center? Her son may be attending there.
Yeah, if you want, you can give me a call after that. If I think I know what you're talking about, it might be there's an adult transitional program up there that I think is funded through Regional Center. But if you want to shoot me a call, it'd be easier to explain it through that, because I would want to call them before I spoke with you. So feel free to reach out with my number. I'm happy to talk to you about it. Yeah, there's a lot of transitional programs in San Diego that are actually funded through Regional Center. We didn't go into that today, but we have Regional Center in California. It's an amazing thing. So if you don't have that and you're a parent of a child on an IEP, you need to call Regional Center and get that going.
You know what? I just had a student in that program. I think it's Vista's alternative to an NPS.
Yeah.
So it's more than just transition age kids. It's kind of their last ditch option before they do NPS.
Oh, so it's not, so that's good, because it's not the one I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of the one that has, it's a center, and then it also has a group home attached to it. I think it's the same name. So we'd want to know that too, Ms. Marshall, if it's the one that's through Vista Unified, or if
yes, it is. Okay. It is their adult school. My son is 21 years old, and I contacted the district to just get him enrolled, and that's where they're suggesting that he attends, and I'm just unfamiliar. So I was wondering if anyone, had any information on that center,
Do you, Jenny? Because I don't. I've never worked with Vista Transitional Center.
I only worked with a student there during quarantine, so I didn't get to see it. If it's the same team I'm thinking of, which I'm pretty sure that's the same name, the principal was phenomenal to work with. Really, really wonderful person, to the point that I sent a letter of appreciation on his behalf to a board member that I knew. But you know what I always recommend to parents is go visit. Just go visit.
Planning on doing that.
You'll really get a sense when you visit it. And you know, you can ask 10 different people and get 10 different responses.
Right.
And what work for one person might work for you. So, you know, I really just encourage parents to go look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, you know, you guys can always reach out. It's Melissa. Thank you for having me very much. I really appreciate it. I hope this was helpful.
Yes, thank you for coming. I know that, yes, thank you. I know that you also have some Zoom workshops that are coming up. I'm going to continue to share those to our Facebook. And just different things that I see that come up in our feed. I think you're doing some amazing work. I appreciate you. Thank you to everyone who is watching with us today. Miss Marshall, if you were not able to take a screenshot, I'll be sure to share Attorney Storey's information. He may be typing it in the chat right now. I'm not sure. But I will get you that number to reach out and ask your more specific question if necessary. Oh, there it goes. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Make sure you check out our website for the video replay on Friday. It'll also be on our YouTube. And we will see you next week. If you're not getting those e-blasts, just go on our website. We can make sure you're on the list.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.